Were magicians the first Christians? I recently wrote an article that wasn't asking that question. It was more of a declaration that, in fact, they were. Now, before I get accused of writing an article that was just clickbait or posing a statement that would cause people to think something differently, I stand by the article I wrote. But the biggest caveat, so to speak, the biggest thing to consider is how we define the term magician. Now, the article was based on the Magi who came to visit the baby Jesus, the newborn Messiah. Now, there is a lot of commentary that could be given on just that portion of Scripture in the New Testament. And in fact, in that article, I did link to a video of a sermon given by John MacArthur. Now, John MacArthur is somebody with whom I disagree in a number of areas, and you might as well. But I think he presented a pretty standard, traditional, and orthodox, with a small o, not Greek Orthodox, with a small o, orthodox, very traditional perspective of who the Magi were. And so I kind of defer to his sermon to give a little bit more in-depth understanding of it. But my article was based on the fact that the Greek use of the term magi, or magos, or magos, however you might translate it, does refer to a type of people. Now, in some interpretations, especially in nativity scenes or plays, there are three wise men. Three wise men. And I put that in quotes. And I don't want to burst the bubble of kids who may be in plays or certain types of depictions of the Nativity where there are three wise men. And even that is explained in John MacArthur's sermon, and it's pretty well known. The odds are great that there were more than just three wise men or three people. And specifically, the scriptures use magi. The original Greek uses that term, or the translation of that term, magi, to describe who came to see him. That being said, the biggest thing to understand is who these magi were. Now, I use the term magician because, in fact, that term magi is very easily, very smoothly understood to be magician or somebody who practices magical arts. Now, before I return to this idea and cause more controversy or upset more people, there are two things that I want to address here. The term magi historically could have referred to an actual tribe of people. And when I say tribe, think of more or less what would be understood as the indigenous people of North America. The Sioux, the Cherokee, other indigenous tribes of North America. Now, they may have been more nomadic than some other tribes. Some of them may have been more stable and created a defined civilization, so to speak. But nonetheless, they were tribal. They were a group of people to which a name was associated. And so the Magi were a tribe of people of the Middle East, probably around the Persian area, that may have or may not have initially practiced magical arts as we would know them. However, by the time that history progressed and the same tribe of people, some of which had gone to visit the baby Jesus did absorb some of the occult or esoteric practices around them. And so this is the second part of that term magi, to which the term magic or magician or magical came. But it shouldn't be assumed that they are the magicians that we know today. And the reason I say that is the ancient form of practicing magic could have very well been very scientific. And what I mean by that is that the ancient form of practicing science or studying and understanding science was lumped into magical arts. Now, this is why I think and I believe the Lord has led me to develop and progress and present the ministry of Nos Logos in a very unique way from my personal experiences, from research, from looking at these different ideas. There is an understanding that historically magic wasn't necessarily just hocus pocus, spiritualism, occultism, demonology, Satanism, whatever term we would understand and have a connotation to it. Before modern day science or the modern day scientific method, empiricism, so to speak, civilizations and people in ancient times tried to understand the laws of nature around us in a way that infused objective science with occult or esoteric ideas. Now, that's not to absolve some of these people from delving into very spiritual ideas, but it is to say that some of them may have tried to objectively understand things with a very limited perspective. So I'm going to take a little bit of a detour here and go off on a little bit of a tangent, and I'll come right back around. My undergraduate degree at the University of Judaism was actually a bioethics degree. It prepared me initially to pursue a medical degree if so desired, which also required me to take a lot of the hard sciences. And even prior to that, I was taking courses. Now, understanding the scientific method, you may be surprised, some of you may not be. The term theory, Theory, is often, more often than not, used inappropriately. A lot of times people will use it to mean hypothesis. And so, if you're familiar with the scientific theory, you understand that you begin with a hypothesis and you end with a conclusion of some type of scientific idea. Once you've made that conclusion, if it then is repeated, your experiment, if your experiment is then repeated, usually has some peer review, has some type of scrutiny, it then becomes an actual theory. And so the point that I'm making is that there is a very strenuous objective process to the scientific method and to which we develop theories. And so I'm just trying to convey that I definitely have an appreciation for objective science. But with that understanding is also a an observation of history. And knowing that before we got to this place in our modern day contemporary ideas of science, there were ancient practices. And so often I'll make the analogy or draw the parallel that we may have began with astrology, but we derived astronomy. Astrology being more mystical, or the use of zodiac signs of such, to astronomy, which is a very hard science of space and stars, and a scientific method approach to that, much like alchemy. Use a lot of metaphorical terms and even entities that represented different types of processes, which then led to some types of chemistry. Chemistry being obviously a hard science that uses different methods of experimentation to test certain chemicals and reactions, and etc. Or numerology leading to mathematics. Numerology being certain hidden codes or patterns within numbers, and mathematics not necessarily being mystical, but just a universal language as it's understood. So, the point that I'm making is that in a lot of contemporary sciences, we have an ancient attempt to understand these things that were infused and clouded with certain types of mystical or esoteric or occult ideas. All that to come full circle back to the Magi. The historical understanding of who the Magi were undoubtedly associated with certain types of magic or being magicians. But if we understand the context that I just laid out, they may or may not have been so nefarious with their magical practices. But it is very reasonable, and I think my article laid out an understanding as to whether they were just a group of people or a tribe of people who were termed magi, or whether they were more likely a group of people who eventually absorbed some of these occult teachings or esoteric ideas into their practices. They were, for all intents and purposes, magicians. And so, in the article, I laid out and explained the first people to come and fall to the ground and actually acknowledge the baby Messiah to be king and to worship him, literally worship him, before any of the apostles, before any of the disciples, before any of the first early church, and the earliest portions of Scripture. The Magi are accredited with being the first to actually, literally fall to the ground and worship Christ. I just think that's fascinating. It's very intriguing. Obviously, within context, we know they may not be today's witches or magicians or sorcerers or things of that nature. But I think it's something that's lost in the Christian tradition of who these wise men were, who these shepherds were, who were whatever people have tried to define them as. If we are honest and objective in our approach to looking at the scriptures, we will find that, in fact, the Magi, understandably magicians of that time, were the first to literally worship Christ. Don't fault me for the scriptures conveying that, as much as I think it's very interesting and food for thought to consider.